In June 1980, a man was found dead in a coal yard more than 20 miles from his home, with suspicious burn marks to his neck and shoulders. Who, or what, could have been responsible? Join us this week as we look into the strange death of Zigmund Adamski. Zigmund Adamski, a coal miner who lived in the village of Tingley in West Yorkshire, England, had spent most of his early life in his native country of Poland. But in 1960, at the age of 37, he and his wife Lottie decided to relocate to the UK, where they hoped to start a new life together. After arriving, they quickly made new friends and soon settled into the small town life of rural England. To anyone who knew them, they were a perfectly happy couple and not disposed to confrontation with others. So perhaps it comes as no surprise that Zigmund's sudden disappearance and subsequent death was so unexpected that it was to leave behind a freezing cold case which remains unresolved to this day. During the afternoon of the 6th of June 1980, 56-year-old Zigmund left his home on foot to buy some groceries from the local shop. As he was leaving, he engaged in friendly conversation with a neighbour before setting off on the mile-long journey into town. The weather had been glorious and all had seemed well on that peaceful summer afternoon, but unbeknown to himself, his wife, or anyone else who knew him, Mr. Adamski would never be seen alive again. For almost a week, and to any and all concerned, he had simply dropped off the face of the earth, and from that moment on, his whereabouts during that time have remained a complete and utter mystery. 5 days later, on the 11th of June, his body was found in a coal yard at Todmorden, more than 20 miles away from where he lived. Trevor Parker, the coal yard owner's son, had been opening the compound gates at 3:45 p.m. in preparation for the afternoon shift when he spotted Adamski's body lying on top of a 12-foot-high coal pile. He had immediately called the police, and a constable, Alan Godfrey, arrived on the scene at 4:10. When questioned, Parker indicated that the last time he had been at the yard was 11 a.m. that morning, and that Adamski's body had not been there at that time. He had also closed and locked the gates as he had left, and no one, to his knowledge, had visited the coal yard since, meaning that the body must have appeared there sometime during those intervening 5 hours. PC Godfrey radioed for an ambulance shortly after arriving, and it was quickly established by paramedics attending the scene that Adamski had suffered a massive cardiac arrest. But on closer examination, and due to a number of suspicious circumstances, authorities began to suspect foul play. Firstly, and probably most disturbing of all, were the second-degree burn marks on the back of his neck and shoulders. These were covered with a strange gel-like substance, which more than likely indicated that someone had tried to treat these injuries whilst he was still alive. Secondly, the way in which he was found, as well as the overall appearance of his body, was not consistent with a death by natural causes. One of the strangest aspects was how Adamski was attired, as if he had been crudely redressed after his death by someone who was unfamiliar with the process of dressing. He was wearing a coat which was buttoned up the wrong way. His trousers and belt were not fastened properly, and neither were his shoes. His wife would later report that the shirt he had been wearing on the day he vanished was now missing, as were his wallet and watch. But on the whole, his clothes were in good condition, which ruled out the probability that he'd been sleeping rough for the past 5 days. Another odd factor was how spotlessly clean his body appeared, as if he had just stepped out of the shower, and even though he had been missing for nearly a week, he showed only 1 day's growth of stubble. Remarkably, there was no trace of coal dust on his skin or clothing, which excluded the possibility that he had climbed the coal pile by himself before succumbing to the heart attack. Finally, and perhaps most perplexing of all, was the fact that there was no sign whatsoever of any footprints in the coal pile itself, or any indication that it had been disturbed in any way by someone climbing it or otherwise. Zigmund was found lying on his back, face towards the sky, and by all accounts, seemed as if he had been literally dropped there from above. P.C. Godfrey went on to describe how Adamski's face had looked contorted with terror, which was later confirmed by the coroner, who said that he must have known great fear or pain at the time of his passing. During the post-mortem, it was concluded that Mr. Adamski must have died between the hours of 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. on the Wednesday, the day that his body was found. He had eaten well during the time he was missing, although not on the day he had died. It was revealed that the burn marks to the back of his neck and shoulders had been inflicted only 2 days prior to his death. The strange gel-like substance which had been applied to the burns was tested by a Home Office laboratory, but could not be identified, and there were no records of him having visited a local hospital for any such treatment. There seemed to be no apparent reason for Adamski's sudden disappearance. He was a good-natured man with few, if any, enemies. He was of a sound mind, and he had been due to attend a family wedding the day after he had vanished, which, it was reported at the time, he had very much been looking forward to. There was a great deal of mystery surrounding the case, and some very odd facets which could not be ignored, such as the peculiar burn marks on his body. Strong hints of alien abduction were in the air by the time the story broke and hit the tabloids during the following weeks, and regardless of how far-fetched, it's impossible to completely dismiss them. Todmorden and the surrounding areas are a known UFO hotspot, and the complexities of this theory are further borne out by the involvement of P.C. Alan Godfrey, who would himself later become an alleged alien abductee. And it would be remiss to tell the tale of Zigmund Adamski and not include the experience of Alan Godfrey, as over time, the two have become inextricably linked. In November 1980, 6 months after Adamski's body had been discovered, Godfrey was on duty in the early hours of the morning when he was dispatched to investigate bizarre reports of a herd of cows which had been seen appearing and disappearing all over a local council estate. Driving down Burnley Road towards the location of the latest sighting, he saw what he thought was an overturned double-decker bus about 200 metres ahead of him. Believing it to be a shift bus for the local coal miners, and thinking that a terrible accident might have occurred, he slowed down to observe the scene. However, on closer inspection, he discovered that the object was not a bus at all, and that it was actually hovering 5 feet off the ground. He tried calling for backup, but found that neither his personal radio nor his dash radio were working. Not knowing what else to do, he noted the time and began sketching the object. After completing the drawing, which took him all of 30 seconds, he looked up to find that the strange-looking craft had vanished. Surveying the scene for any further sign of it, he suddenly realised that his car was further along the road than it was before, almost a quarter of a mile distant to where he had originally stopped. And upon checking his watch, and despite the fact that only a minute seemed to have passed, he found that he had lost almost half an hour, time which he could not account for. Later on, he would discover that the soles of his standard-issue police boots were split at the toe, in a way that suggested he had been dragged along the ground. Shortly afterwards, he returned to the police station and asked a couple of colleagues to help him search for the missing cattle. The cows were eventually located in a rain-soaked field, the only access to which was through a locked gate, and although the recent rainstorms had softened the ground, there were no hoof prints to be seen. Like Zigmund Adamski, they seemed to have been literally dropped there. As standard procedure dictated, Godfrey reported his encounter with the strange object later that morning and discovered that another driver on the same road, only 3 miles further along, had seen a white light and reported it to Todmorden police. 2 weeks passed by without further incident, but the report of Godfrey's experience was somehow leaked to the press, causing himself and his department a great deal of embarrassment. Despite being an outstanding officer, with 2 commendations for previous police work, Godfrey found himself being alienated by his colleagues and slowly pushed out of favour with his superiors. With his once solid career effectively ruined, he eventually left the police force. Some years later, Godfrey would undergo hypnotic regression and recall his encounter in greater detail than we have time for here, but suffice to say that it carries its own disturbing connotations. Recounting the case of Zigmund Adamski, Godfrey was to relate how it had been one of the strangest cases he had ever been assigned to. But regardless of his own experiences that same year, he was somewhat unsure of whether UFOs had actually been involved in Adamski's death, though he didn't rule out the possibility. Some 25 years later, British UFO Research Association, or BFORA, investigators interviewed members of Adamski's family and found that he had not, in fact, been looking forward to his goddaughter's wedding. There had been a family feud during this period, and a female relative had moved in with the Adamskis. This relative had taken out a restraining order on her own husband, and needless to say, things were very bitter between the two. In light of this, 2 overriding theories have transpired regarding the whereabouts of Mr. Adamski during those 5 days. On the one hand, BFORA concluded that Zigmund had actually been kidnapped by the female relative's husband and held in a shed where he had been tortured with battery acid and had finally suffered the fatal heart attack. This could well have been the case, and it's quite plausible that when Mr. Adamski died, the estranged husband had panicked and dumped the body at the coal yard, but there are still many unanswered questions over this explanation. By all accounts, Adamski was a neutral bystander in the family feud, so why had he been kidnapped? What could abducting him possibly achieve? Secondly, Zigmund had obviously been in a state of undress at some point during his disappearance, but why? And what was the ointment found on his skin, and why had it been applied, especially if his captor had wished to do him harm, as suggested by the burn marks? Why had his body been dumped on top of a coal pile during broad daylight? Why not hidden in a more discreet location and at a less obvious time of day? And how did the person who dumped his body even get access to a locked coal yard and then further manage to leave not a single trace of them having been there? Finally, and perhaps most importantly, why was no one ever arrested or charged over the kidnapping? It is clear that this theory is far from conclusive. Many other people believe that extraterrestrials were somehow involved and that they had abducted him at some time on the 6th of June as he had made his way to the local shop. From that point, he had been held in some kind of suspended animation, thereby explaining the lack of stubble growth and the appearance that he'd been eating healthily. When he was pulled out of stasis, possibly for examination, he was so overcome with shock as to what was going on that he had suffered a massive cardiac arrest and died. But the possible involvement of UFOs raises even more perplexing questions. It was reported at the time that Zygmund's wallet and watch were missing. What could extraterrestrial beings possibly want with his valuables? This point alone leads many to believe that the reason for his disappearance has a more earthly explanation. Secondly, accounts of most alien abduction cases suggest that although the experience is generally very frightening and at times mild physical discomfort is felt, the captors themselves are fairly benign and do not wish to harm their subjects. Why then had Adamski sustained various malicious-looking burns? Could it have been accidental on their part, hence a supposed effort to treat him, as indicated by the strange ointment, which, oddly enough, could not be identified by modern science? Finally, and the question must be asked again, why would his captors dump him on top of a coal heap in broad daylight? Why leave a mystery at all? Why not hide the body where no one would ever find it? Was there a feeling of guilt amongst those who took him? A feeling that he should be returned to his home? Whichever way you look at it, there is no denying that there is more to this mystery than meets the eye. And although the family feud scenario is probably the more plausible of the two theories, it is by no means conclusive, and any other assumptions, regardless of how fantastical, are by no means ruled out. There could be 100 other reasons why Zigmund Adamski disappeared on that fateful day, but whatever the explanation, it will forever be consigned to the pages of history as yet another unsolved case. May Zigmund rest in peace.